It's great to see you all in such huge numbers with a crazy day out here. I'd request you to please, try and keep the aisles free and especially the center ones. It's for your own safety. It's a no smoking zone and also it's a free festival, so please don't reserve any seats. Flash photography is prohibited. You can tweet using hashtag ZJLF or tag ZJaipurLitFest. In case of any emergency, please remain calm, and there are quite a few exits here. And don't leave your valuables anywhere. It's your responsibility. If anyone wants to buy the festival full program, it's available at the information desk for INR 100. It's also a collector's item. So we'll start the next session. It's the Library at Night, presented by Rajasthan Patrika series. We welcome Alberto Manguel in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury. Thank you.
कर्नाटका और तमिलनाडु का अग्रणी हिंदी अखबार, जिसमें छपी तीखे तेवरों के साथ ताजा और विश्वसनीय खबरों पर हर पाठक करे विश्वास। 8 राज्यों में 35 संस्करणों के साथ प्रकाशित होने वाला एक भरोसेमंद अखबार, पत्रिका।
The management work for number 1 leadership in the whole country.
राजस्थान पत्रिका ने पूरे विश्व को जोड़ा है। बधाई देती हूँ मैं आपको।
पत्रिका समूह।
And I was told that readers were disappearing.
They all come here.
This is where they were. When they flee North America, this is where they come.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and welcome to, it was supposed to be an hour, but it's now only half an hour with but a very good half an hour, hopefully, with one of the greatest readers in the history of literature and definitely the greatest writer in the history of reading, Alberto Manguel.
Thank you.
Alberto, you are much envied by a lot of people for having one of the most beautiful libraries in the world, not just in terms of its collection, but also its location. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it? We heard about a library at night.
All my life I've had libraries. As a child, I had a small library, and at every chapter of my life, I've had libraries. But as almost everyone else, I've always lived in small spaces, so the library could not be contained. And I've sent my libraries to a storage room. Now, finally, 15 years ago, I found an old, dilapidated presbytery in a small village in France, a village where I see more or less between 2 and 3 people a week. So it's very different from here. But in that space, there was enough room for all my books. There were about 30,000 books. They've grown to 35,000, 40,000 in the past 15 years. And that's where I keep my books.
Well, when you wrote a book with Borges in 2006, something that not a lot of people knew came out into the open, and from then on, so many people began to envy you because when you were a child, you lived in Buenos Aires, and you were selected by Borges himself, who was nearly blind at the time.
He was blind.
He was blind. To come and read to you every evening. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
I was an adolescent working in a bookstore after school for pocket money. And Borges used to come to that bookstore to buy books. It was a time where he had decided he would study ancient Anglo-Saxon. And his mother, who was about 90 at the time, got very impatient with him and would say, Georgie, because she called him Georgie, Georgie, why don't you study something useful like Latin or Greek? But he persisted with his Anglo-Saxon and would come to the bookstore to buy books on the subject. And I would sell him the books he wanted. And Once he said to me, if I wasn't doing anything in the evening, to come and read to him in his house. Now, you have to know that I was one of the hundreds of readers that Borges asked to read, because he had become blind in the mid-50s. This was the mid-60s. And of course, as blind readers continue to need books, they continue to need the eyes of other readers. And it was a very peculiar thing, because when Borges became blind, he decided that he could no longer write prose. He said that he would continue to write poetry, because poetry came to him as a music to which he would add words, and he would compose those words in his head and then dictate them. But prose, he said, you had to need to see your hand write. But writers establish these rules and then break them, because Borges began to imagine stories. And after a time, he was so pregnant with those stories that the stories had to be born. But before writing them, he wanted to see how the great writers, the writers he thought were great, had written their short stories. So he would ask me to read the stories that were his favorite by Kipling, Henry James, Chesterton, Stevenson, and writers in other languages. And it was a curious process, because it was the process of a watchmaker who wants to see how watches were made and take them apart and see how the cogs fitted. So I would start to read to him a Kipling story, and after 2 lines he would interrupt and make a comment. Oh, how interesting that Kipling uses this word. It will reappear 3 pages later in a different context, but the reader will. So it was very much a workmanship kind of reading, in which I didn't exist, except for a voice.
Well, was it that early then that you began to perceive what I think is the essential point of your book, A History of Reading, and the point that every reader, once they see it, they begin to see themselves as much more active and much more important in the life of literature than sometimes they presume they are. And that point is that the history of literature and the history of reading are completely separate things.
Borges used to say that a writer writes what he can, but a reader reads what he wants. And that difference struck me as fundamental, because we are told that the histories of literature are written through the eyes of writers and according to what writers want to say. But that isn't true. Every writer wants to be remembered. Every writer wants to be a bestseller. Every writer wants to be a classic. And we readers are not touched by their pleas. The only thing that we are confronted to is the text, and if we like it, we keep it. If we don't, it goes into the dustbin. So the history of literature is not the history of writers, but the history of what we readers have chosen to put on our shelves. And that led me to write A History of Reading, which is an inquiry in what it is that I do.
Well, you also say in A History of Reading, and this follows from the point you just made, that readers also, just like writers of the past, were subversive.
Oh, definitely subversive, because we change the text according to our interpretation. And sometimes the best readers are the censors. In Chile, the dictator Pinochet, General Pinochet, banned Don Quixote because he said it was a defense of civil liberties. And he was absolutely right. Not that he was right to ban the book, but he was right as a reader, because he saw in Don Quixote that fundamental subversiveness.
One of the things that readers responded to most in the history of reading, and I did too, was this romantic but still very true idea that we connect books not just with the words in them, but the particular editions we first read them in. And therefore, it is very painful to give books away because they are a record of our own past.
Absolutely. We are fetishistic. And I always say that to lend a book is to encourage theft.
Yeah, I agree. Sure, everyone here would.
So if I want to give a friend a book, I buy the book and give it to him. But those editions in which we read a book are the original editions. My paperback of Moby Dick is the real edition. I have better editions, more scholarly editions, but that tattered paperback records my reading of Moby Dick and has phone numbers jotted on the margins that I don't know to whom they belong, and train tickets going to places that I don't remember having visited. A library is, in some sense, our autobiography.
When you go visit other people's houses, sometimes people you don't know at all, do you look at the libraries? And do you feel like somebody's library could kind of be their autobiography?
I'm glad that my morals prevent me from stealing. Not always.
What is the best book you've ever stolen?
Now, I'm not going to confess that here, am I? Let us say that it hasn't happened frequently. But it is true that when I go to someone's house, the library is a portrait of that person. If he has more Plato than Aristotle, he is a friend. If he has the works of Paulo Coelho, I will have great difficulty in having a dialogue with that person.
Well, I have to tell you, Alberto, that Paulo Coelho is seen by a lot of Indian people as the greatest novelist working in the world today. The Alchemist, the greatest book.
Well, Borges has a story called Utopia of a Man Who's Tired, who imagines that in the future, because we change our opinions and become so arbitrary in our choices, Hitler has become a hero.
Okay, I meant to ask you, you've outlined a broader literary tradition here, but you're also part of a significant side tradition in literature, which is the literature of bibliomania, the literature about the history of books, about book editions, about the love of books.
Yes.
And one of the very interesting things you bring up in your book about Homer is the extent to which he was admired by the Arabs for a bit.
Absolutely.
Including by one of the great readers in the history of medieval literature, Jahiz the bibliomaniac.
Absolutely.
So why don't you tell us a little about him and Jahiz's library at the time?
Well, it's difficult to speak in less than half an hour about that.
You've got 2 minutes for this one.
But I must say that so much of what we considered Western literature, which as we know, Western culture, Western civilization, which as we know Gandhi thought would be a good idea, comes to us from the Arabs, comes to us from the reading of the Arabs, the translations of the Arabs. And Aristotle came into the Western tradition in the Middle Ages through the Arab translations. Greek culture had been forgotten, much of Latin culture had been forgotten. So in the West, we have a curious idea that the world began in London or Paris, and literature proves that it might not have been so.
Well, since we don't have a lot of time, I still thought we should have at least some sense of the taste of your prose and of your book. So I was wondering if you would read one of the best paragraphs in the history of reading. The bit where you begin...
In my history of reading, not in the history of reading.
Yes.
Okay.
The bit that begins with Borges here.
Yes. Borges once told me that during one of the populist demonstrations organized by Perón's government in 1950, Perón was one of the many dictators we have had against the opposing intellectuals. The demonstrators chanted, "Shoes yes, books no." The retort, "Shoes yes, books yes," convinced no one. Reality, harsh, necessary reality, was seen to conflict irredeemably with the evasive dream world of books. With this excuse, and with increasing effect, the artificial dichotomy between life and reading is actively encouraged by those in power. Demotic regimes demand that we forget, and therefore they brand books as superfluous luxuries. Totalitarian regimes demand that we not think, and therefore they ban and threaten and censor. Both, by and large, require that we become stupid and that we accept our degradation meekly, and therefore they encourage the consumption of pap. In such circumstances, readers cannot but be subversive. And I would like to add, even if they are our sponsor, that Amazon shows as the books that deserve being remembered the books of Paulo Coelho and other such pap. Buy books from independent bookstores.
Paulo, maybe you've been disinvited to tonight's dinner party, but let's forget, let that be for a moment. I think the two wonderful points in that paragraph, one, that readers have so much power and we must resist political power, which sometimes wants us to turn us into narrower readers. The second very important point is that the distinction between, which a lot of Indian students sadly are always told to remember, the distinction between life and literature is a false one, and the two are sometimes very much the same thing.
My grandmother would see me reading and say, "Go out and live," as if what I was doing in the pages was not living.
And I think Eliot says something about this as well. The fact that when you sit down at home reading, turning pages of a book, that's sometimes the bits of your life when you're mentally the most active and that you move forward the most as a person.
That is where life happens, between the pages of a book for me, because literature gives me the words to name my deepest fears, my most secret emotions, my most ardent passions, and tells me what I don't know I know. A line from Emily Dickinson defines something that I intuit but cannot or could not put into words until I have read it. The lines go, "Presentiment is that long shadow on the lawn, indicative that suns go down, and a warning to the startled grass that darkness is about to pass."
Beautiful. For a long time, 500 or 600 years now in the history of literature, so as much as we can remember, when people have said read a book, there has been no dissonance in our minds between the content of books and the form of the book itself. We know what people are talking about. Would you say that in an e-reading age, you can get the same out of, that there's no contradiction between reading and reading on an e-reader? And is the history of the physical book important, and is it necessary for us to try and preserve this?
There is a great difference between the text we read in different containers. That was a difference that those who were startled by the text on the papyrus scroll noticed when they said it's not at all like the clay tablet that was easy to hold in your hand and you could see the physical dimension of the book when the tablets were in a box. Now we have a scroll. We don't know how long it is, and we have to create the page as we go, as we do on a computer. But while it's important to know about the distinction and to think about it, it doesn't make a difference if you find those words that you want in a Kindle or in a printed book. I'm from a culture of the printed book. So for me, the the printed page is important. I want to scribble on it. I know that you can apparently scribble on Kindle. I've never used it. But the physical element, the physical contact, the smell is something that belongs to my relationship with a book, with my amorous relationship with a book. And in the same way that I don't believe in virtual sex, I don't believe in virtual literature.
Okay. Very fine. Do readers write to you sometimes saying they want to come look at your library in France? And what do you say to them?
Well, fortunately, I'm very busy.
I see.
But sometimes they come and they sneak into the garden, and well, it depends on the persistence of the reader.
It just seems you're not that welcoming, even though.
Well, and I wouldn't say that I'm not welcoming, but I find it an invasion of my private space. My library is like the inside of my mind, and you have to be very careful what you let come into your mind.
When you travel, which I know you do a lot, isn't there a problem then with having a big library, or is it more clarifying in that you choose 2 or 3 books in the library for those weeks, and then you'd have no other choices, so you're very clear about how you can go forward reading?
Indeed, I pick certain books when I travel, and the Victorians had a book bag, but now I travel more lightly, so I take 2 or 3 books when I travel.
You said the distinction between virtual reading and physical reading is a very big one, and you would like to know, readers, that there's a big gulf between the two, so they're not the same thing. Is there a big difference between paperbacks and hardbacks?
Of course.
And what is that?
It's a difference of hierarchy. The text, the electronic text has more or less eliminated hierarchy. So that if you read, and I'll go again to the example, Paulo Coelho, on the screen, and you read Shakespeare on the screen, and you read the India Times on the screen, they all appear the same.
Yes.
A paperback, a beautiful bound edition, a 15th century manuscript appear to have certain qualities that we give them, of course. I mean, the hierarchy is in our mind.
Suppose you had to host a dinner at your house for 5 or 6 people, the greatest readers in the history of literature. Who do you think you'd pick? I think maybe like Plato and Jahiz, but who else?
Plato was not a great reader. And in fact, that whole culture, while it wrote everything down, was not at all interested in books. And well, we won't go into that. But I would pick you, who is...
Oh, that's very nice. This
an
is got me on the great
reader.
days.
You're an extraordinary reader. We had a conversation last night, and he reeled off all these authors that I love and that he had read. So definitely you're invited.
This is very nice. I'm coming.
Can I pick dead people?
Yes, yes. We must have some of them too. In literature, no one is dead, so...
Absolutely, yes. Quevedo called reading conversations with the dead.
Yes.
So Borges, of course. We are talking about readers. So Diderot was an extraordinary reader. Curiously, I would pick Rumi because I think his reading, if not of a large amount of text, his reading of the world coincides somehow with mine. Virginia Woolf was an extraordinary reader. Are there enough?
You have a very big table. I saw a picture that we could have a couple more.
Someone said that an ideal dinner party has more guests than the graces and less than the muses. So, all right, let's have someone else. Oh, it's so difficult, and I know the caterer is waiting.
Well, never mind. I have some other questions.
Well, let me say, a dear friend of mine who's a great reader, and we have fantastic literary discussions, Rohinton Mistry.
Okay, very well known here. Do you still read aloud, and what is the purpose of reading aloud?
The purpose of reading aloud, I think there are many purposes. You read aloud to a child because you want to bring the child into the world of that particular story. You read aloud to your lover to share that amorous space.
Yes.
You read aloud to yourself because there are texts that need to be spoken. You read aloud to Borges, but then you take everything away, the tone, the intention, the choice of the book, and you become the eyes that he does not have. And you read aloud to the public, and that gives the public the tone that you bring to your reading, but that is very dangerous. In high school, my generation, our erotic upbringing was with the 20 love poems and a desperate song of Neruda. And we adored it, and we said the verses to one another: cuerpo de mujer, blancas colinas, muslos blancos, te pareces al mundo en tu actitud de entrega, and so on and so on. One day we found that Neruda was coming to our school. So we all flocked an hour before into the hall, waiting for the great poet to read. And then the great poet stood up and read from 20 poemas, and he read, cuerpo de mujer blanca. That almost put a halt to our erotic upbringing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we could have had so much more fun, but we sadly only have half an hour, and therefore we have no time for questions. But Alberto will be back at 5. He'll be back at 5 this evening. We have another event, so try and come to that. We're going to give up the stage now to the next event. Thank you so much for being such a great audience.
Thank you.